See that lone pine up on that hill over there? What are we actually doing right now? The kids are just wild out there. They're wild. But they're having a good time, you know? They're having a good time. This is Untamed Unbroken, The Adventurer's Guide, and I'm your host, Blake Bredesen. Welcome to Untamed Unbroken. Today we're talking shelters. Talking building shelters in the outdoors, construction steps, pros and cons of some of the basic shelters. So let's get into it. The importance of a shelter. It's going to protect you from the elements. That is number one, keeping you dry in the rain or snow, shielding you from wind, prevent heat loss, provide shade from the sun, preventing heat strokes or heat-related injuries. Number two, you have safety from wildlife and insects, offering a barrier against animals, could reduce insect bites, stings, etc. Number three, the psychological factor, the comfort and the boost in morale creates a sense of security. Sometimes it's a false sense of security, but it does help in that overall comfort feeling of being outside. And it helps maintain that mental well-being. Now, what are the situations for shelter building? Now, there's recreational camping or just for recreation or for fun. You know, I grew up building forts as a kid. So it's one of those things where you could just go out and build a shelter, build a fort, have some fun, enhance your camping experience by doing it, provide some comfort and a place to store gear if you're just using a little shelter for some gear or you're just doing it for fun recreationally. And then there's the emergency scenarios, survival scenarios, which are going to become essential for protection and surviving that situation, whatever it might be. And then in that case, it's going to help you conserve energy, body heat, and give you a place out of the elements. So let's get into the basic principles of shelter building. We'll start with site selection. So you want to avoid hazards. You want to stay clear of falling branches or dead trees or widowmakers. Now, widowmakers are, you look up and you see a limb that's just kind of hanging there in the tree or a dead limb or something like that. You want to avoid that. Those are often termed widowmakers or just like even a dead standing tree. You just don't want to be putting a shelter right next to those things because those are a higher risk. If you get any bit of wind, those could get blown down. You want to avoid low-lying areas prone to flooding. And you want to just stay away from animal trails or dens or trails in general, game trails. Just stay off of those a little bit. You want to think about proximity to resources. So near water resources, but not too close to avoid any flooding concerns if you're near a river or something like that. And then you want access to firewood and building materials. Again, that might depend. If you're in a survival situation, you might be limited in those. You do what you can with what you have. And you want to consider terrain, looking for flat, dry ground, looking for natural windbreaks, maybe dense vegetation or hills, rock formations. Again, you want to be careful around any rock formations or anything like that where you could have falling rock coming down towards you. After site selection, we want to look at shelter design and just the various ways you can build a shelter. And the principles kind of behind it. There's three main ones. Insulation and warmth. You're going to use natural materials for insulation, leaves, branches, pine boughs. You want to ensure the shelter traps body heat. Number two, you want some ventilation. You want to allow airflow to prevent condensation. If you have a fire nearby, you can ensure that the smoke can escape if you are using that fire. And then stability and durability. You want to build a sturdy structure that can withstand the weather, withstand the wind, and keep you sheltered from it. You want to use strong materials and secure them as best you can. Those are the basic principles of building a shelter. Now let's move into the types of basic shelters. We have a few. We have the lean-to. We have the A-frame, debris hut, the tarp shelter. Those are the four basic ones we're going to kind of go through. And then there's variations off of, especially when it comes to the tarp shelter, depending on your tarp. There's so many variations. If you have some cordage, there's a lot of variations that you can go with on a tarp shelter, making it into an A-frame or a lean-to even. So let's start with the lean-to. We're going to go through this. We're going to go through materials you need, construction steps, some pros and cons for each of these. So the lean-to, you're going to need some long, sturdy branches or poles if you have those. Some smaller branches and foliage for covering, some rope or even vines for binding, tarp or poncho if you have it. Like those kind of things are optional. The steps to this, you want to find a strong support. So if you can find 2 trees in that 6 to 10 feet apart, and then you're going to put a main support beam. So placing a long sturdy branch or pole horizontally between the trees at about shoulder height. And so then you're going to have to figure out a way to, maybe there's branches coming off those trees, or you're going to have to use some rope to bind that pole to those trees. And then you're going to take shorter branches and just lean those branches against that support beam at about a 45-degree angle, forming that basic lean-to structure. And then you can cover those smaller branches with leaves. You could put a tarp over it if you have to, pine boughs for insulation and a little protection from rain. And then if needed, you want a little bit more windbreak, you can build a windbreak on those open side, just stacking logs or using additional branches to kind of cover those sides. Winds always change, but typically you want to build that so the open area is, the wind's not blowing directly into your shelter, but you're breaking it up a little bit ideally. If you're there for longer than a day, winds can change and you have to deal with that. But pros and cons of the lean-to. Pros, easy, quick to build. Usually you got some readily available materials, and it does provide good wind protection. The cons is it's a little more limited space. Open side can let in that rain and wind, and it's not very ideal for cold weather without any additional insulation. Now, what you can do is build a reflector wall, have a fire right in front of you. You're sitting back into the lean-to. You have your fire out in front, and you can build a reflector wall behind that fire to reflect the heat in towards you. That can help. Let's move on to the A-frame shelter. Another classic out there. You're going to need some long branches, sturdy branches for a ridge pole and the frame. Then again, smaller branches, leaves, pine boughs, or a tarp for covering. Rope if you have it, vines if they're available, if you don't have rope. But you really do need some sort of cordage for this. You can make it work without, but it is very helpful. Construction steps. So you have your main ridge pole. So you're going to secure a long branch horizontally between 2 trees, or use a forked stick at one end. Like a couple of branches. Or the stick works too. Just a straight stick with a little fork on the top that you can put a ridge pole on one end. The other end maybe is to a tree, preferably for that sturdiness for the structure. And then frame support. So you're going to lean branches against those ridge poles on both sides. So you form that A. And then you just cover, layering those smaller branches, leaves, pine boughs, or a tarp over that structure for insulation. Maybe you throw that tarp over if you have one, and then just layer it with a bunch of pine boughs if you have those, or other smaller branches and leaves over top of that. And then the entrance. So then you're going to leave one end open for entry, or create a small doorway. So that other end, you probably want to cover that up too with sticks if you can, so that there is only one entrance and one open side. The pros to this, it's going to be more enclosed than that lean-to. It's better for retaining heat. It's stable, it's sturdy, and it's versatile. This can be scaled to any size, triangles or the strongest geometric shape. so that those you can scale that, and it's still going to be strong as long as you're using the sturdy branches. Cons: it's a little more time consuming to build. It's going to require more materials, maybe slightly less headroom, maybe a little less comfortable for sitting or moving around in. Moving on to the debris hut. Again, you're going to, materials wise, you're going to need a long, sturdy branch for the frame, large amounts of leaves, grass, or other debris, pine boughs for insulation, and some smaller branches for layering. So construction wise, you're going to need that main support beam. So you place a long branch horizontally on the ground, one end supported by a sturdy tree or a forked stick. The frame construction, you're going to lean branches against the support beam on both sides, forming a low triangular structure. And then insulation layer, you're just going to pile leaves and grass and other debris over the frame until it's thickly covered, at least 2 to 3 feet deep if you can. And then that entrance is just create a small opening at one end, ensuring it can be easily blocked with debris for additional insulation. So the pros to this: it's excellent insulation. It retains your body heat really well, provides great protection from the wind and the rain, and it uses an abundant, it uses natural materials. The cons is it's time consuming to gather that amount of debris. It's not very spacious. There's not a lot of room in there, and it requires maintenance to keep that insulation effective. Next one we got is a tarp shelter. So you got various materials of tarps. You got polyethylene, you got nylon, steel nylon, different sizes too. So, one of the most versatile sizes of tarp for tarp shelters be like a 10 by 10 or even a 12 by 12. I like square, a perfectly square tarp, because they're more versatile in some of the configurations that you can do. We're going to just talk about 3 configurations: the A-frame, the lean-to, and the diamond fly. So you can, the A-frame and lean-to that we just talked about, you can just do that with a tarp. So the A-frame, you secure that tarp between 2 trees with cordage, forming that ridge line, stake down the sides. Good to go. Super quick. Lean-to, you attach one edge of that tarp to a horizontal support, maybe a tree or a ridge line, or that branch ridge line, and then you just stake down the opposite edge. And then you have the diamond fly. So you secure the tarp's corners to trees or stakes, creating a diamond shape. Pros and cons, right? The pros are it's lightweight, it's portable. There's a lot of configurations you can use, and it's quick and easy to set up. The cons would be limited insulation. Depending on adding additional materials, can be noisy if you're trying to be quiet. Recreationally speaking, if it's a survival situation, who cares if it's noisy? Noisy is probably better. And tarps are more vulnerable to damage, sharp objects, etc. So personally, whenever I'm going somewhere, I always have a tarp with me. I like to carry a 10 by 10. Would it be nice to have a 12 by 12 at times? Yes, it definitely would, to have the extra length and width there. But the best option, if you have it, is to build one of those shelters out of wood, out of branches and stuff, and then incorporate a tarp and then insulation of materials like pine boughs on top of it to give you kind of the best of both worlds there. Takes a little bit more time, but in the end, it's a better shelter, especially if it's just recreational and survival too, if you're physically able to. Now we're going to talk about a couple of shelters that are a little different. Snow shelters. The Quincy, the Igloo. Quincy is actually probably one of the shelters I have built the most of. You used to build them this one's pretty easy. You just pile a bunch of snow into a mound, let it settle, punch a bunch of 6-inch long sticks into the top, and then hollow out, after it's settled and hardened, hollow out that interior, ensuring with those sticks that it maintains at least 6 to 8 inches of width so that it doesn't cave in on you. That's the danger with quinsies, is if they get too thin, they could collapse on you. If you let them settle and you let them get hard, they kind of almost become like ice in a way, really, really hard packed snow. And they can be very, very good, very warm shelter. In the igloo, you're just cutting blocks of compacted snow and stacking them in a spiral pattern, just in like a brick-like way. So insulation properties with snow shelters is the snow does provide excellent insulation due to trapped air pockets and just the structure of snow. And so those temperatures on the inside of the shelter are going to be much warmer than the outside. They block wind completely. But the safety considerations, you need to ensure there's ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup, especially if you're using a stove or a fire with that. And then you just have to regularly check the structure's stability. That's the biggest consideration. And then there's elevated shelters, tree platforms. You're using sturdy branches or ropes to create a platform in a tree. You got to ensure that platform's secure and stable. Use hammocks, attaching a hammock between two trees with a tarp overhead for rain protection. That's if you have a hammock. Like, we're not really even talking too much about that stuff, but safety and stability with these is just always test the stability before use and use good knots, reliable rope. So let's talk a bit about shelter building in different environments. You have forested areas, desert areas, mountainous areas, coastal areas. So in those forested areas, you're going to have an abundance of natural materials, branches, leaves, foliage, everywhere. So suitable shelters for this would be a lean-to, A-frame, debris hut. You're going to have all the materials you need in there. When it comes to desert areas, you want protection from sun and heat. So shade is critical, right? Ventilation is critical to avoid heat buildup. You're going to have some construction challenges in that limited natural materials. So use rocks, sparse vegetation, and tarps. So using rocks and tarps to your advantage if you have those in those desert areas. Mountainous areas, use natural windbreaks, wind protection, get you out of the wind. Shelter stability on slopes, so try to build on a flat area or as flat as you can. Create that level platform. A lot of times in mountainous areas, if you're below the tree line, there's going to be plenty of materials for you as well, where you could build pretty much anything you could. That lean-to, A-frame, debris hut, or tarp shelter. If you are up above the tree line, you try to get down below the tree line. Coastal areas, you want to make sure you are building above the high tide lines. You can use driftwood, sandbags if you got those, tarps, all sorts of material just on the coast that you can find, any rock, stuff like that for windbreaks. Just make sure you're above the high tide. Other than that, same rules apply. Let's talk about essential tools and materials for shelter building. Basic tools, knife, multi-tool, rope, cordage, shovel or digging tool. You're going to want these things. If you have a saw, that's awesome. Some sort of hatchet or axe of some sort. Some materials to carry, you have emergency blanket or a tarp, a bivy sack, some insulating materials, maybe a space blanket or clothing for that. Those are just some of the essentials for related to shelter building. All right. Safety and maintenance of shelters, another big thing here. Inspect and repair. You want to just check on structural integrity, repair anything that you can to make it structurally intact again. Fire safety, proper placement of the fire relative to your shelter. I kind of talked about if you were having a lean-to and having a fire reflector built up behind the fire, making sure that it's a proper distance, not too close to your shelter, but not far enough away where you can't really feel the heat when you're sitting in the shelter. You also don't want to start your shelter on fire. So there's that. And then just safe fire construction techniques. If you're in a really heavily wooded area, sometimes it's really nice if you're able to put down if you can find some flat rocks to have that fire on top of. And so it's not right in the dirt. Otherwise it's digging away all the debris and material where you're going to have that fire. And then obviously there's always wildlife precautions, right? Food storage, waste disposal, avoid animal attractants if you can. All those things always apply when you're out camping. Some final tips would just be go out and practice building a couple of these shelters. At a minimum, practice constructing various tarp shelters in different configurations or setups. And my advice would be nail down one that you're really good at and could do when you're injured or in a survival situation. Nail down one that you're really good at, and you can just go to that. Because in a survival situation, you're just going to automatically, you're going to go to your level of knowledge or your level of training. And if you read about something one time, but you've never practiced it, your brain isn't going to remember how to do that in that situation. But if you've practiced setting up this particular tarp shelter or this particular lean-to shelter, you're going to give yourself a better chance. So go out and practice. Stay wild. Thank you for sticking around. If you've enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a rating and review. Even one word, it helps a ton. Sincerely appreciate you guys. Thank you all, and we'll see you on the next one. Stay wild.
You've been listening to Untamed, Unbroken, a Lone Pine Adventures original podcast.